Good morning and let's start. So good morning to everybody here at Tiedekulma and online as well. A warm welcome to this event from my side. I'm Juho Korteniemi. I'm from the Finnish Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment. And I was the chair of the steering group, which report we will present today. And this morning we will indeed discuss the carbon use and removal solutions and focus especially on the industrial solutions. And as such, this is also a final seminar of the project which studied those solutions. And this project was funded by the Government of Finland's Analysis, Assessment and Research activities. And on top of the Finnish speakers, we have today some international guests here, so welcome Nordic guests as well to this event. So why the Finnish government funded this project? What is the background why we are today here? The first thing was that we understood also at the government side that there is significant potential in these kind of solutions in Finland. However, we don't know enough of them, and there is kind of a lack of knowledge. And as I speak on behalf of myself, I can say that lack of understanding in many ways as well. The second point was that we want to, of course, be well prepared in international discussions and negotiations on this topic, be it on the EU arena or in global contexts. So we, of course, need good knowledge base also for that. The third motivation was also, of course, to maybe provoke some discussion here in Finland as well. Everybody knows here in Finland that we will have, of course, the parliamentary elections, for example, coming up very soon. So maybe this project will also work as an important background paper for the national talks. And I'm actually happy to notice that many companies have actually during the latest days and weeks announced the interest to actually research more deeply in this field and try to do actually practical projects, which is of course very interesting and welcome. And luckily after this project, I think I can say that we definitely now understand this theme better, and today actually will be a great opportunity to hear all the results of the project. So the project highlights, and you will hear all those presentations later this morning. There are three main topics: technologies, markets, and policies. And on top of those, there is also an international benchmark made in this during this project. So I would like to thank the whole project team and my steering group colleagues for very good work. And I of course hope that this report and this event today will provoke active discussion on this field. And hopefully the report will be read today. It should be published just actually today in English and later on in Finnish as well. And then of course that's a good read for everybody during the coming weeks and months as well. So I wish you all very fruitful and interesting morning. And let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Juho, very much. And also thank you for steering the steering group. It has been of great support and help for the project. My name is Oras Tynkkynen and I will be facilitating today's seminar. And I will not be taking much of your time because, as Juho suggested, it is a very interesting and complex topic, and it's good to have enough time to dive a bit deeper into these various perspectives on carbon use and removal. However, what I will do is just to remind you that we have set aside quite a lot of time for discussion towards the end of the seminar. So please do note down your questions and comments, so we will be able to get back to them a bit later on. And for those of us, or those of you rather, following this online, you can share your remarks throughout the seminar, and we will be picking them up from the chat when we get to the discussion section. We want to hear from you, we want to hear your perspectives, and we want to get questions, hopefully, if any, on these interesting topics. Now, this is the fruition of a long project, and we have been working for more than a year. There are a lot of things to unpack, and we don't have a whole lot of time, so let's get right into it. We will start with the first presentation about the key findings of the project, and to do that we have Alexander Resnitchenko from the VTT Technical Research Center of Finland, and he will be talking about the main technology pathways from the Finnish perspective when it comes to these interesting technologies. Alex, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Aras, for a kind introduction, and thanks to all of you who chose to participate in this event on this busy weekday morning. So hope it's going to be fun for you, as much fun as it was for us, the project team working together, 3 different research institutes with a strong participation of our steering team from the ministry. So thank you all for the opportunity of being part of this project. This has been a lot of fun. So my name is Alex, and I'm representing VTT, Technical Research Center of Finland. So I'm going to be giving a quick overview of our findings when it comes to the main technology pathways for carbon use and removal, and especially their relative importance, or the lack thereof, to the Finnish context. So to give a quick reminder, and before we dive into the topic, I hope you can see slides well on this interesting background. We're going to be using throughout the day a lot of abbreviations related to different technical options of carbon dioxide removal, carbon capture and storage, CCU and such. There has been some ambiguity in literature, and unfortunately it still persists, but we try to be reasonably systematic within our project and throughout our report. So here are some of the key abbreviations which you will see today in this and some of the forthcoming presentations. Quite many different verbiages when it comes to the CO2. But hey, let's continue perhaps on the definition, and as a quick reminder, what really makes a particular technology using CO2 a carbon removal technology, and what are the key differences versus emission reduction or carbon neutrality. Basically, we have 2 main axes to look at, which are the source of CO2, whether CO2 is originating from a fossil feedstock, such as normal fossil fuels. And here, the CO2 coming to be used in removal or storage technology can be captured, for example, from atmosphere directly, or it can be captured via biomass growth, or as said, it can be the normal CO2-based, fossil-based CO2 emission. In principle, we can achieve potential removals when the CO2 coming into the picture is originating directly from atmosphere or is captured from the atmosphere via biomass growth. However, another important parameter is the permanence of the removal and what we're going to do with the CO2 we capture from the atmosphere directly or indirectly. As an example, we can grow some biomass and produce some short-living biofuels, and then of course use them in combustion engines and then emit CO2 back to the atmosphere. And in that sense, the CO2 is perfectly biogenic, originated from the atmosphere, but the short time of the removal will not make the technology carbon removal. So we will end up with some emission reduction or at best carbon neutrality. So today, throughout the presentations of this work package and the following one, we will be trying to focus on the technologies which are on the upper right corner on this diagram, which are basically tailored towards CO2 captured directly from atmosphere via technical means or via biomass growth, and those technologies who either already demonstrate or have potential to reach long permanence of the removal from the atmosphere as such, or in the form of some stable product, which would not release CO2 to the atmosphere at the end of the life cycle. So this is what we're going to be focusing on, and this is the type of CO2 we're going to be talking about. So perhaps not that new to most of you, but we thought that it would be good to start with some basic definitions of what kind of CO2 we are talking about. And as a segue towards different types of CO2, of course, CO2 as such is always same molecule for a chemist or chemical engineers, but the origin of it and where it comes from and in which form makes a lot of a difference towards how feasible the exact engineering solution for capture and usage would be, what would be associated costs and technical difficulties. And here, this is a diagram related to the most significant point CO2 emitters in Finland. There is less than 100 relatively large emitting facilities, and the picture in Finland, perhaps not unique to the Nordics and our neighbors in Sweden, but rather different when compared to many EU countries, in the fact that point source emissions in Finland are largely biogenic in nature. So that dashed green area of the circle shows that there is about, well, more than half of the 40 million point source emissions of CO2 are biogenic by nature, and they are coming from our very strong forestry, pulp and paper, and biomill product industry, as well as from production of bioenergy. So we were talking about the importance of the source of CO2, and here is how these source pictures of CO2 looks like in Finland. And this is, of course, very relevant to the context of what are the particular removal technologies we will be considering. When coming to the technologies, still introductions and some definitions. When talking about the removal technologies, it is good to separate it into two technical boxes. One is the CO2 capture part, how we capture and concentrate CO2 from either atmosphere directly via some technical means, or when using some biomass growth as a means to capture and concentrate this carbon. The part of capturing basically results in concentrating, purifying, and preparing the CO2 feedstocks towards its storage or transformation into some long-term lifetime products. For the utilization and storage path, there are several options. There is CO2 storage as such in geological formation, use of CO2 as such as a product. There are a lot of industrial uses where CO2 is used. Then conversion of CO2 into various products, the so-called capture and utilization path. And basically here, we try to focus on the options which allow for high permanence of storage and utilization. So basically, as you can see, there are quite many options for capture part and quite many options for storage, and that results in a rather complex matrix of different opportunities, combining different options for the capture, different options for the source of CO2, and different options for the storage, which makes it in a way a rather complex picture. But in our report, we try to break it down into some tangible options and try to see from a practical standpoint how ready are we to deploy this particular technology, especially in Finland. So let's dive into some capture technologies. And as a reminder, we start with the so-called direct air capture technologies, which are the technical solutions tailored towards capturing the CO2 from air. We've been talking a lot about the raising contents of CO2 in the atmosphere, but in practice, from an engineering standpoint, we are still talking about very low concentrations. And whether we're talking about Finland or some other country, concentration of CO2 in air is the same. And this is basically the main technical challenge resulting in additional CapEx and OpEx costs. A lot of energy is needed to concentrate that stream. And even though there are a lot of demo facilities throughout the world, they are currently limited at rather low technology readiness, and there are high associated costs coming simply from the fact that the stream is very dilute. But it is possible to be done technically, and it is possible perhaps to scale up the technology, even though the associated costs remain quite high. Our conclusion that perhaps this is not the most relevant option to be pursued in the Finnish context at the moment. When it comes to point source CO2 capture, I already gave you some picture of what are the point sources of CO2 in Finland, but the whole benefit of a point source is that they are typically much more concentrated than the atmosphere. So here we are talking about some real high percentages of CO2 in the stream. Of course, such flue gases still need to be treated, purified, concentrated, but we are talking a lot about much lower energy costs and demands in this case, which results, of course, in a much more attractive business cases and CapEx and OpEx pictures. So the quality of feed can be varied, and some of the best feeds are, for example, the fermentation plants for the production of bioethanol, which results in a very pure and concentrated CO2 streams, which are probably a dream for a carbon capture company or a process. We are here talking about much lower costs compared to direct air capture, and as said, Finland has an advantage of a very large, relatively concentrated point sources. Of course, this bioproduct mill, such as an Äänekoski mill, does not produce these 2 million tons of CO2 in just one stream. There are quite a few point sources throughout the site, but still compared to direct air capture, this is of course a much more attractive feedstock to be handled, and especially for Finland, where bioenergy and bioproduct production are dominating sources of CO2, we believe that this is a very relevant option for the capture technology. Coming still through the different options for the capture and already touching a little bit on the utilizations, I mean, I've mentioned that it's not just a technical solution, but also the biomass growth, which can be used to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. And in that sense, biochars and wood products are good examples where combination of biomass-based capture and the long-term end applications can be achieved. So basically, it has been long observed, and probably it is a millennia-old technology production of biocoals and biochars, but a controlled pyrolysis of lignocellulosic residues of forestry or some agricultural residues produces pyrolysis oils, gases, but on top of that, it produces varied amount of the so-called biochars, which are high carbon content porous solids, carbonaceous solids, which are very stable and in fact are close to indefinitely stable in environment. We are talking about some century and millennia. And production of such stable source of carbon from the biogenic CO2 eventually results in carbon removal. And this is the technology which is relatively cheap, relatively scalable, and it is already at, I would say, small industrial scale demonstration level in different countries, especially in Finland. The capacity is growing, and there is a number of initiatives in the private sector. This is relying on different types of residues from forestry and from agro biomass production. And of course, Finland here has a good starting position to be at the forefront of this particular technology for the capture. Now we move into the domain of the storage and utilization. So we've been talking very briefly about some key options for capture. And storage and utilizations, let's perhaps start with the oldest story, which is the geological storage of CO2. This is now decades-old technology. There is a good story of some industrial operations for over 30, 40 years, I would say. So technology readiness is definitely at commercial level. Suitable geological formations can be found, and CO2, once it has been captured and concentrated, can be, of course, pumped underneath, whether it's in marine environment or whether it's onshore. Unfortunately, it is what it is, but in a few studies conducted over the last 10, 15 years, it has been ultimately concluded that there are no appropriate sites in Finland or nearby onshore to partake on these CCS projects. Most viable and most close by locations would be the Norwegian projects in the North Sea. Some feasibility studies are ongoing in the private sector, and of course, some cross-border partnerships will be needed should this technology be employed in Finland. Of course, when it comes to the actual products, I mean, the storage of CO2 does not produce any viable, tangible product other than CO2 removal, as opposed to, for example, producing of biochars, which is something tangible and can be applied. But of course, storage and removing CO2 and pumping it under in some suitable geological formation is not the only options when it comes to what we can do after we have captured and concentrated the feedstock. Another option is the so-called CCU, or carbon capture and utilization products. So here we are actually talking about not something very exotic. We are talking about the products which we encounter in our everyday lives quite frequently. We are talking about plastics, we are talking about concrete, we are talking about construction materials. All these products are high volume commodities, or in some case specialty products. They are produced at large scale, and they are highly carbon positive at the moment. It has been found by a number of companies and research institutes that the carbon positivity of these products, for example, concrete or some synthetic polymers, can be systematically challenged if our CO2-based feedstock is incorporated at least partly in production of these synthetic polymers or, for example, artificial aggregates in concrete. So here we are talking about materials which are used at high scale in construction industry. And if we talk about polymers, some applications in infrastructure, energy, such as wire and cable, are quite high permanence and longevity applications, especially if we talk about chemical recycling. And there are paths now under development in Finland and also throughout the EU where some demo projects related to, for example, carbon neutral or even carbon negative concrete or CO2-based synthetic polycarbonate polyols are in productions. These are all potentially high volume products, but of course there are some limitations with respect to how much CO2 you can really store in those. In many cases, high energy intermediates such as epoxides or slag ashes, which are currently produced through rather carbon intensive methods, are still needed. So perhaps total carbon negativity is still a dream for these type of paths. A more interesting path, at least from a theoretical standpoint, is the so-called power-to-X approach, where the use of renewable hydrogen allows to completely reduce the CO2 molecules towards some suitable synthetic intermediates, such as methane, which is perhaps the least interesting, but then methanol, paraffin, and olefins are key intermediates in the petrochemical industry, and they are, of course, used for production of energy carriers, fuels, and at the moment, there is a high interest also in Finland to come up with a small demo-scale power-to-X demonstration projects, which will utilize renewable electricity to produce green hydrogen and then produce either methanol or hydrocarbons, for example, for sustainable aviation fuels and other similar applications. Of course, here the focus at the moment in the industry is towards short lifetime products, so fuels, energy carriers. We are very far here realistically from the carbon removals, but we see that this path offers potential synergies, very good synergies, to use the same value chain and when producing methanol or paraffins or olefins, to explore also path towards, for example, synthetic polymers, which are the heavy hitters of the petrochemical industry. We are talking about some hundreds, if not thousands of million tons produced annually, and this path potentially provides possibility to produce these synthetic polymers entirely based on CO2, which of course would result in eventual carbon removal for the long-term applications. Currently, as said, low permanence products are in focus, and this has been due to the fact that fuel and energy carrier segments have been a bit more advanced in terms of regulations and also pressures from the customers. The wish to incorporate more sustainable aviation fuels can be one example where mandates and public awareness are driving the implementation of this more expensive path. But we see that potentially this has a very good future also in the context of the removal technologies, as it can reach high permanence entirely based on CO2 and relying on the green hydrogen production. So, trying to stay on time, this is perhaps a time to summarize the story a little bit. And basically, long story short, there are quite many technical options. There are several options which are relatively advanced for the storage utilization of CO2, and there are several options which can be deployed for the actual capturing and concentrating the CO2 towards something which can be usable. All of the technologies discussed, they come at additional costs versus benchmark case. Whether we are talking about just removing CO2 or whether we are talking about producing products which already exist as currently fossil-based and carbon positive, incorporation of these technologies will eventually bring additional costs. And these costs are different for different technology paths. And of course, substantial R&D and I effort will probably bring these costs down to some extent, but we still believe that most likely the industrial deployment of these technologies will result in additional costs versus benchmark case. And it is up to the policies and regulations how these additional costs will be distributed between different value chain partners and customers, producers, and governments, if you will. When it comes to what are the most tangible options for Finland, we believe that Finland is very well positioned towards emission reduction and also carbon removal technologies by having a very strong clustered sources of bio-based CO2 emissions, which dominate the point sources of the emission in Finland, and that is, I think, that's a very good starting point, which is not necessarily the case in many EU countries. There are already established companies, startup, and very high level of activities in different research institutions and also in private sectors related to biochar, carbon capture, and also inorganic products such as artificial aggregates and carbon neutral, carbon negative concrete. And these are the starting elements which will, of course, help Finland to stay competitive in terms of technology experts, but also eventually, hopefully, in the product experts when it comes to carbon removal technologies. Still, last but not least, hydrogen and Power-to-X is a very attractive topic, which is currently focused on short lifetime products resulting in emission reduction and not so much of carbon removal. But we believe that strong ambition of private sector and gaining momentum of projects related to hydrogen and Power-to-X, pretty much every couple of weeks we hear some exciting announcements here also in Finland, will eventually lead the path towards incorporating of this technical path for the actual carbon removal and carbon negativity. So long story short, there is still a lot of work to be done, but there is good potential and a good starting point. And of course, when technologies alone will not be able to solve it without additional regulatory framework and policy decisions. So we will hear more about this later on. I would like to thank you all for your attention, and also big thanks to our project team, especially our project leader Lauri, who has been a motor of this project. So it's been a lot of fun, and we learned a lot, but there is still a lot to be learned. So thank you for your attention.
For summarizing what is a very diverse and complex space from a Finnish perspective. For those of you who want to dive deeper, we do have a lot of information, further additional information in the report that has been released, I can confirm today, so you can hopefully find it on the website tietokäyttö or tietokauttoon.fi in Finnish, and for the English speakers, I would just guide you to use Google and use the name of the project, because these Finnish website addresses are a bit hopeless. I would like to just remind a couple of things at this point. If any of you, like myself, have had to wake up a bit too early this morning, we do have coffee and tea available, so please feel free to get some or get a refill. Also, for those of you who have a lot of questions now going through your head, please note them down mentally or on a piece of paper, or if you're following us online, you can already share them in the chat and we will be picking them up from there. We will come back to the markets and policies in just a moment, so this was a good introduction leading to those in a couple of seconds. Next up we have actually Alex's colleague from VTT, the Technical Research Center of Finland, Sampo Mäkikouri, and he will be talking about the financial drivers of carbon use and removal. So please, Sampo, take it away.
1, 2, CO2 check, CO2 check. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Sampo Mäkikouri and I'm a research scientist from VTT. And today I will talk about the financial drivers of carbon use and removal. This work was a joint effort, and as you can see, I got a lot of help from a number of my colleagues. And thanks a lot also for the steering group. It's been a pleasure working in this project. In this part of the work, we try to answer the following questions. What is the current status of carbon markets? How are the markets developing in the future? What effects could the streamlining of regulation have for the markets? And which export opportunities can be identified for Finland? Let's talk about the size of the markets first. The European Union emission trading system accounted for about 90% of the global market, of the global carbon market in 2021. That's about 683 billion compared to the entire global voluntary carbon market of about 280 million euros. And this blue dot is the Finnish voluntary carbon market service providers segment of about 6 million euros. So this is to put into perspective the carbon markets at the moment. Okay, that was about euros, but how many tons of CO2 is currently removed or used by the CDR and CCUS methods that we studied? As you can see, most of the current CO2 removals, the CDR, is happening on managed land and in the growth of the carbon stock in harvested wood products. BECCS, biochar and ducts combined are less than 0.1% of the total. For comparison, the current voluntary carbon market was about 100 million tons. The captured CO2 volumes are also significant, but most of it goes to short-term use or enhanced oil recovery. 130 million tons for urea production and 80 to 70 million tons for the EOR. CO2 that goes to dedicated storage is about 9 million tons per year, and a little extra that goes to CO2 mineralization products. And on this slide, on the 0.1, I have a mistake by 10. The correct number is in the report. So it's, instead of little addition, it's a very little addition indeed. But that's the current status. But how much of CO2 could potentially be removed by the different carbon dioxide removal methods? Estimates vary a lot, and there are a lot of new methods and ideas coming up, but at least these gathered options could each remove at least 1 gigaton of CO2. To put that 1 gigaton of CO2 into scale, the global greenhouse gas emissions in 2022 were about 58 CO2 equivalent gigatons. First, we have the mature methods, CO2 removal on managed land, but that already today was about 2 gigatons per year. So where do we get the extra CO2 removals? We can focus more on these and strengthen those, but in addition, we have the emerging technologies like BECCS, ducts, and biochar. Then on research level, enhanced weathering and ocean alkalinization show also significant potential. So that was about CDR, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. This is about CCS projects, capturing CO2 from industrial facilities, such as power plants or heavy industry. I have 2 points from this slide. Firstly, there is a strong growth in the projects during the past, in the CCS projects during the past 5 years. And secondly, more than half of the projects were based in Europe. Why is that? We'll get back to the EU emission trading system soon. In the project, we also summarize the costs and future cost estimates for CDR and CCUS. And you could literally spend years studying these. And we already had some numbers from Alex displaying, for instance, the direct air capture cost or the cost of CO2 capture from point sources. And we try to here summarize the costs in euros for the entire value chains. But again, there's a lot of variation depending on the specific case you're looking at, and what we could do in this project was to cite a number of sources. But for instance, there's some potential in CDR on managed land with less than 20 euros per ton costs, and here it's generally just displayed as below 100 euros per ton, and that affects the potential, for instance. Cost of ducts, for instance, is currently the highest, as Alex mentioned, but the costs could decrease with the technology development, but then when and if we cannot know for sure. And the cost ranges for BECCS and fossil CCS are broad, depending, for instance, on the original CO2 concentration of the industrial plant, the total CO2 volume of that plant, the cost of logistics, and especially significant from the Finnish standpoint, the availability of heat, and many other parameters. As for carbon-containing products, it's not so easy to say which part of the product price is actually the value of temporary carbon storage. And however, what we can generalize from the Power-to-X is that the cost of Power-to-X products are generally higher than those of the fossil alternatives. Okay, so now let me try to point out a few specific financial drivers that explain the current status of the carbon markets. Firstly, EU ETS. There has been a tenfold increase during the past 5 years in the CO2 emission allowance price, reaching over 100 euros per ton. This, we believe, is one factor explaining the growth in fossil CCS projects in the EU. For Finland, it's also good to know that ships transportation and CO2 stored permanently permanently in products are to be included in the EU ETS, but perhaps we'll come back to this in the next presentation or in the following presentation from another Sampo. About voluntary carbon markets, still it's mainly about avoided emissions or CDR on managed land, but there is a trend to require more of certified CO2 removal specifically. These have already been a significant driver for some methods like biochar, and it appears that the proposal of the European Commission on CDR did not yet have a clear financial impact, but this is definitely something to follow up. There is a strong interest in Finland towards power-to-X projects. Currently, especially methane production, even though it's like short-lived, but I've listed a few reasons behind this trend. Firstly, there is an existing market and an existing infrastructure for methane. The revised Renewable Energy Directive creates more demand. And also as a result from the Russian attack, the natural gas price has increased dramatically, and also better energy security is wanted. What we can say is that BECCS, DUCs, and fossil CCS do get deployed if sufficient long-term funding and incentives are available. National incentives can help, and here are a few examples already from Sweden, the US, and Norway. But let's not forget the basics either. Business is better when you get more money for your product and the costs are lower. Both can be achieved, for instance, through technology development. But in some cases, the main financial driver can be something totally different too. For instance, in the case of mineral waste, avoiding the landfilling costs. Okay, let's summarize then. First, the EU ETS is the main financial driver for carbon markets at the moment. Voluntary carbon markets can boost some activities, such as biochar. And the export potential of DUCs technology and power-to-X could be especially significant for Finland. And BECCS could be a sizable CDR method in Finland, but currently we have no existing financial drivers that would enable the needed investments. And in my opinion, this is the main bottleneck for the deployment of BECCS in Finland. And here are the references. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you indeed, Sampo, for summarizing the situation with the markets and the financial drivers. To the different incentives and policies, we will come back in a couple of minutes. But now we have time for our first international keynote speaker, who will be Malin Pash, who is a doctoral candidate of, and I need to check the name, KTH Royal Institute of Technology, what I think used to be Kungliga Tekniska Högskolan. I'm old enough to remember a different name. Anyways, it is clearly a very prestigious university that collects some of the brightest minds in the Nordics and internationally. Malin will be talking about the Swedish perspectives on bio-CCS or BECCS, which is of course of high relevance for Finland and many other countries as well. Så välkommen Malin, och väldigt trevligt att ha dig här i Helsingfors.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. As you now know, my name is Malin Pash, and it is a great pleasure, of course, for me to be here today and participate in this very important discussion on carbon dioxide removal. And so today I will be talking about the Swedish perspective, and I will focus on some Swedish policies for net zero emissions and bio-CCS or BECCS. So, the Swedish Climate Act was adopted in 2017 with the long-term target of achieving net zero emissions by 2045 at the very latest. And so to achieve this, Sweden shall reduce emissions by at least 85% compared to 1990 levels. So that is a minimum requirement. And the remaining emissions, so the remaining 15%, is to be compensated for or neutralized through something called supplementary measures, which is defined by Sweden as negative emissions from bio-CCS, forest carbon sinks, and international mitigation. And so international mitigation, that is emission reductions outside of the Swedish borders. So in terms of carbon dioxide removal, we are looking at the first two alternatives, and today I will be focusing on bio-CCS. And so after achieving net zero emissions, Sweden intends to also become net negative. So what is the role of supplementary measures? Well, as I said, Sweden has a net zero target for 2045 at the very latest, and the maximum amount of allowed residual emissions by that target year is 10.7 million tons of CO2. So that's quite an important amount of CO2 that needs to be compensated for. And that is where the supplementary measures come in. And also on the way to net zero, Sweden has some milestone targets where supplementary measures also can play a role for goal fulfillment. And so the graph here shows the indicative levels for supplementary measures from 2020 to 2045, which is the net zero target year. So the plan is to gradually build supply and capacity for these supplementary measures. And so we saw that supplementary measures will be important for goal achievement in Sweden, and that bio-CCS is one of these supplementary measures. So what is the potential for bio-CCS in Sweden? So Sweden, just like Finland, has large point sources of biogenic CO2 emissions, and that is mainly from the chemical pulp industry, heat and power, but also from waste incineration, where part of the waste is biogenic. And so this map here shows some of these main point sources in Sweden and Finland. And so for the specific case of Sweden, Sweden emits approximately 32 million tons of biogenic CO2 per year, so that can be considered like the maximum theoretical roof at the current point. And I've seen different estimates of how much of these biogenic emissions is actually capturable. And we have numbers up to 31 million tons, so quite a large share of this is at least theoretically capturable. And this can be compared to the residual emissions, the maximum amount that is allowed by 2045 that should not exceed 10.7 million tons of CO2. So we can see that, at least in theory, bio-CCS could play a very important role in actually neutralizing these emissions and also exceed it. And so it's also, of course, important to talk about storage when considering bio-CCS. And Sweden does have some theoretical potential for geological CO2 storage, but there are some very important barriers that currently hinders the realization of this potential. And namely, we have a lack of data and experience compared to, for example, Norway. And there's also something called the HELCOM Convention, which protects the Baltic Sea. But it also currently prohibits geological CO2 storage in the Baltic Sea, which is where Sweden would have its potential. And therefore, Sweden is currently looking to export the captured biogenic CO2 for storage outside of the Swedish borders. So, okay, we saw that there is great potential for bio-CCS in Sweden, and that is one of these possible supplementary measures. But what is the role per supplementary measures? Because there are multiple possibilities. So what is the role for bio-CCS? And that is basically what an inquiry from 2020 called Vägvalsutredningen tried to answer. And looking at this graph here, you have this indicative level for total supplementary measures. And you can see that bio-CCS is expected to play an important role. And this is, these are not goals or targets, but rather an assessment of what might be an appropriate contribution from bio-CCS. So by 2030, you can see that it's expected that an appropriate contribution might be about half of the total supplementary measures. And then you have this range, of course, due to uncertainty in the future. But you can see that bio-CCS is expected to play an important role or a very important role. And so, in addition, this inquiry also suggested that bio-CCS potential should initially be realized through reverse auctions in Sweden, because currently there is a lack of incentive to actually deploy bio-CCS. And so, after this inquiry, the Swedish Energy Agency also looked into different possibilities to support bio-CCS in Sweden, and they found that, in line with the inquiry, they found that reverse auctions is the most suitable support system for bio-CCS in Sweden. And they further suggested a 15-year support period, which is supposed to give the participating actors a sense of security and long-term commitment and predictability, because we're talking about some important investments here and longer timeframes. And so, of course, as with any support system, we have both pros and we have cons. And so on the pro side, one potential pro is that reverse auctions has the potential to be cost effective if enough actors participate and if there is enough sense of a competition during the bidding process. And also that the state can control the cost of the support system. And then on the con side, one con might be that reverse auctions requires resource-intensive preparations by the participating actors, and this might be particularly difficult for smaller actors, which might disfavor the smaller actors. And another con is, of course, that if this sense of competition is lacking, that cost efficiency is less likely to be achieved. So, it has been decided upon that reverse auctions is the most appropriate support system. So what is the current state? The Swedish Energy Agency has the role of auctioneer in Sweden, and the first auction is planned this year during 2023. It was originally planned last year in 2022, but it was postponed due to awaiting state aid approval from the European Commission. And so currently that is the holdup. But if everything goes according to the current plan and the first auction actually takes place this year, there is also this expected time delay of approximately 3 years from the first auction until CO2 is captured. And so that means that if everything goes according to the current plan, we might see some deployment of bio-CCS in Sweden from 2026. And so the very newest news is that the Swedish Energy Agency suggested that actors that are generating these negative emissions from BECCS while receiving state support, that they should at the same time be allowed to sell carbon credits to the voluntary carbon market. So the way this would function is that an actor that's generating negative emissions and receiving state support, they could also sell carbon credits to the voluntary carbon market, and then they would have to pay back the income from the selling of these carbon credits to the Swedish state so that there is no overcompensation. And in this announcement or this recent suggestion, it was also suggested that negative emissions from bio-CCS should be counted towards the Swedish climate goals, regardless of the financing source. So regardless of whether it's actually the Swedish state that's paying for these negative emissions, or if it is a private financer from the voluntary carbon market, regardless, the negative emissions generated should be counted towards the Swedish goals. And so this, of course, has some very important implications. And so to start, in order to avoid double claiming, this means that actors on the voluntary carbon market should make contribution claims and not compensation claims, which are currently a more popular claim. And so to kind of illustrate the difference between the type of carbon credit and the associated claim, I have this figure here. So imagine that you have an actor that is emitting some CO2 or some greenhouse gas emissions. They could either choose to compensate for their emissions in full and maybe make some net zero or carbon neutrality claim, or they can choose to contribute to Sweden fulfilling its climate goals and then make a contribution claim. But if they choose this latter route, they cannot make a compensation or net zero or carbon neutrality claim because the negative emission has already been claimed by the Swedish state, right? And so, of course, it's unknown, the kind of market demand for this, but that is basically the current suggestion from the Swedish Energy Agency. And this, furthermore, lastly, this implies that Sweden aims to receive international finance from the voluntary carbon market to achieve the national climate goals. So that's, of course, notable. And so in addition to the reverse auctions that are planned, there's also another support system for bio-CCS called the Industrial Leap Program that finances research, pilot and demonstration projects, and different types of projects that support the net zero emission transition within the industry. And so you have different kinds of projects that can receive financing. For example, emission reduction projects in the process industry, and also negative emissions, where of course bio-CCS comes in, but also other technologies such as direct air capture. And as of 2022, almost 1,600 million Swedish crowns has been allocated, and slightly less than a third has gone to projects related to CCS, which has enabled 20 projects on bio-CCS specifically. And of course, this has increased the knowledge and experience on bio-CCS in Sweden. And I would also, of course, like to mention that the Industrial Leap Program finances my research on policy support for bio-CCS in the Nordic countries. So to summarize and conclude, I have shown that bio-CCS can contribute to the Swedish climate goals and is expected to contribute to the Swedish climate goals. But it is very important to note here that Sweden has no specific target for carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions. The only thing we have is this maximum roof for how many residual emissions we allow by our net zero target year. And this can be compensated for through, for example, negative emissions, but not necessarily. So we also have the option of international mitigation. And so it's very important to keep in mind that although negative emissions is expected to be important, and specifically bio-CCS, there is no specific negative emissions target. And so in terms of support, we're looking at the Industrial Leap Program and the reverse auctions that I talked about to provide this initial incentive for bio-CCS. And one remark also that I would like to make is that although currently not considered, there are other carbon dioxide removal technologies that might contribute to fulfilling the Swedish climate goals in the future. These are currently excluded, or not excluded, but not considered due to maturity and feasibility reasons. But of course, Sweden is very much aware that the suitable supplementary measures must be constantly revised. And so I would also like to finish this presentation by saying something that I think is very important, that regardless of the contribution from supplementary measures or negative emissions, the main measure needed to achieve net zero emissions is emission reductions. And that is, of course, as true in Sweden as it is anywhere else. Thank you.
Tack så mycket, Malin. Väldigt fascinerande. In the expert space, there is a lot of discussion about the best policy incentives for deployment of these solutions, and I think everyone is looking up to Sweden and the experiment of the reverse auctions, and I hope we can learn a lot from that. Also for policy measures in Finland, which we will come back to in a moment. Just on a personal note, I'm half based in Stockholm, and I can literally see the Stockholm XRC's bio-CCS facility from my window, so it's very close to my heart also in a very concrete way. Next up, we have another interesting Nordic case from Denmark in this case, who is joining us online, and we can already see you. Hi, Tobias. Very good to have you here. Tobias Sørensen is coming from Concito, which is one of the leading climate think tanks and a brilliant institution. I've been very happy to work with you guys on a number of occasions. Tobias works as a senior analyst, and he's going to tell us about the momentum for carbon removal in Denmark, and I'm sure we can learn a lot from the Danish case as well. Tobias, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I hope you can hear me well and see the slides. Otherwise, let me know. I will give a perspective on the Danish carbon removal situation, and title it the momentum for carbon removal in Denmark, because we have a lot of focus on scaling up CCS at the moment, which we have seen can also constitute carbon removal. My job in Concito is to look at the Danish climate targets. How is it going? Are we on track? What are the role of new technologies, including CCS, CDR, Power-to-X, and so on. And today I will, of course, be talking mostly about CCS and some carbon removal. But just to give you an idea of where Denmark is now and why this focus on removals and CCS is that we have a climate law. It demands 70% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990, and climate neutrality no later than 2050. The latter is to be reviewed pretty soon and become more ambitious. I will get back to that. Today we emit around 45 million tons, and this must be reduced by more than 20 million tons in just a few years to achieve the target. So this is obviously a big effort in short time, and we need to reduce in all sectors with all possible means. And this has also stimulated a lot of focus on carbon capture and storage on some application. This is not a technology that solves all our problems, but it may become a very important tool in the next coming years. As in Finland and Sweden, we also have a lot of biogenic sources of carbon emissions, and of course CCS and these constitutes carbon removal if done right. There's of course some issues with what kind of biomass do we use, what are the alternatives of this use. We have set up 3 dedicated funding programs for CCS, including for negative emissions. They're expected to deliver 3.2 million tons in 2030, some of it also before. Then we have, of course, the ETS price, and we have also agreed on a national carbon tax reform that provides some incentives. I'll get back to. So the figure to the right, you see the emissions today. The majority is from agriculture and then transport. Energy emissions are decreasing steadily, and industry is also getting there. There's still a long way to go to achieve the 70% target, and especially when we look at the agricultural sector, the challenges are huge. Most of the Danish land is for agriculture, so that of course emits quite a lot of greenhouse gases. More on the incentives for CDR and CCS. I mentioned the carbon taxes. We expect ETS to be around €100. It can be more. That would be good. That would provide more incentive. But right now the baseline is €100 in 2030. Then the Danish carbon tax on energy and industry. We do not have on transport and agriculture yet, but this is being debated, and probably in the end of the year there will also be some targeting agriculture and transport. But on energy, non-ETS, it's 100 euro in 2030. But for ETS sectors, it would only be 50 euro, but that's on top of ETS, so it's some incentive to reduce. Cement, because it's there's more competition globally, it will only pay 17 euro on top of ETS, and waste to energy facilities, which we have quite a lot of in Denmark, will pay 100 euro on top of ETS, meaning 200 euro in 2030. That's quite a great signal for reducing emissions from waste to energy, including with the CCS, which may be very relevant there. Biogenic emissions, however, are not covered, so we need something else. That's why partly that the government or a majority of the parliament has agreed on 3 funding schemes, total 5.2 billion euro over a period of 25 years. That's a lot of money, but it's spread out over a lot of years, and expected to deliver 0.4 million tons in 2026, 3.2 in 2030. And the current expectation is that the government will do tenders for this. So similar to the Swedish reverse auction, where bidders compete on price here and how much they can deliver in a given year. There's one tender going on now, which aims to establish the first large-scale CCS project in Denmark, from capture, transport to storage somewhere. We don't know where. We have 3 bidders: one waste incineration, one biomass heat and power plant, and one of the only cement plant in Denmark is participating. And they must deliver 1.4 million tons in 2026. We will know more about the prices in May when the winner is announced, and we're looking very much forward to getting started with this first project and get some more insights to what are actual prices that the market can deliver. Of course, there's also the voluntary carbon market that can provide some incentives, but it's still a black box. We don't know what they offer to the companies being in the current bid or planning in the future, but they're there, and they might play an important role. But how much is CCS, including carbon removal, is relevant by 2030 in Denmark? We try to establish and consider a CCS hierarchy. So we get some different estimates from what the state or industry organizations get for the potential in Denmark. But we ask 3 questions, which are somehow related. But when we look at the point sources, we look at, are there many operating hours and a long lifetime? Some will stop operating in the end of the 20s or in the beginning of the 30s. Some will be operating less and less due to competition from other sources, and they might not be relevant because a capture plant is a quite resource capital intensive investment. So we should also look at other better alternatives. Can we electrify some of the heating? Can we electrify some of the industrial processes and so on? And then we look at what is the actual climate benefit from, for instance, burning wood for energy. What would happen if we did not burn the wood? Could we use heat pumps instead and leave the wood for in the forest, or for others to use the limited sustainable resource that is available? So summing up, that gives us 5 million tons of CCS in 2030, of which 3.5 is of biogenic origin, and therefore CDR. We get the majority from waste to energy plants. That's roughly half the capacity today, or the emission today from waste to energy. We have a lot of biogas plants that is upgrading to the natural gas grid, and thereby already separating CO2. They are very relevant and cheap sources of carbon capture. Then we have industrial processes that's mainly cement, but could also be refineries as long as we need them. That is, of course, some insecurity around that. but cement we will probably need for some years to come. And the exact composition of the emissions from cement is still to be decided, and depends on if they transition to some kind of green fuel, such as biogas. Then more will be of biogenic origin, but there will also be some fossil CO2 from the production of cement. So that's kind of our rough estimate. It can be a bit more, it can be a bit less, but as you see, we do not expect biomass due to economic reasons. Biomass heat and power plants to play a large role. They can play some role, but due to less and less operating hours, and some are running out of time, the potential is actually limited. I must say that the government expect that biomass CSP can provide 5 to 6 million tons of CCS in 2030. So there's not a broad agreement on this. It is a contested issue. So CCS seems like a very important technology in Denmark, but looking at the big picture, from our view, yes, it's important now, but it's a minor part of the overall transition towards achieving the target in 2030 and towards climate neutrality and net negative emissions. It's very complicated now because we don't have a full-scale project. We will soon begin the first one, but a lot of other things has to happen in transport and agriculture, industry, and so on. So it's not an excuse for doing nothing in other sectors, not at all. Then we have looked at a scenario for climate neutrality by 2040. And we've done, well, we took all our colleagues from agriculture, from energy industry and transport and so on, and said, where do you expect, with very ambitious policies, where can we be in 2030? And the transport folks were like, we will electrify everything quite soon. Prices are going down on electric cars and trucks and so on. We expect this to kick in, maybe with some higher taxes on petrol and so on. Might help this, but we will get pretty far in 2030. Agricultural people, land use, were also quite optimistic in this scenario, but of course with some insecurities. But expecting that new technologies for reducing methane from cows and maybe a smaller livestock production and more plant protein, we can decrease emissions from agriculture quite rapidly. But still, we have around 10 million residual emissions in 2040, 9.5 to be exact in this scenario, which will have to be compensated by negative emissions. So what negative emissions do we assume here? Well, we assume that we can go large-scale CCS on selected waste biogenic sources, biogas, the remaining waste to energy, industrial processes on biogenic feedstock. The biochar is also very relevant in Denmark with some waste products from agriculture. Forests could be more, but there's also some land issues with existing agriculture, but we believe that it can do more than today. And the DAX is direct air capture is of course the most insecure in this scenario, but it will need to scale up or some kind of other technology because we don't have more biomass feedstock or land for forest. Otherwise, it would take up some of the agricultural space, or we would have to import more biomass feedstock from other countries to fulfill our climate neutrality target, which is not our recommendation. We import most of the biomass for energy today, some of it certified sustainable, but there will be increased pressure on biomass sources as we most I think are aware. So we need to figure out how we limit it to the truly sustainable sources. And that is still to be decided, but I think that's an important topic when we talk negative emissions to discuss further how we get this right. almost my last slide here, but that's just this is not the climate law yet, but the new government came into power last year. They introduced this 110% target in 2050, which is all far away, but we believe it's actually very reasonable to start talking about climate neutrality is good, but it's a target on the path to net negative emissions, which is where we need to go in order to solve the climate crisis. We already emitted too much, especially on the way to 2050. So we will start have to clean up the atmosphere again with net negative emissions, and then we think this target is a reasonable way to get started. Also a discussion on how to get there, but it basically means that we have to go net negative with 8 million tons in 2050. And we estimate that maybe around 6 million tons of residual emission is realistic in 2050, mainly from just processing agricultural land. It's difficult to completely avoid any emissions. And that will sum up to a total negative emissions of 14 million tons, which is quite a lot. And we do not have enough bioenergy sources just to get there. So some kind of dark order technologies will be necessary. But it will also give an enormous incentive to reduce emissions because of the marginal cost of getting to net negative is very high. Then the remaining emissions should also be quite expensive for the emitters. So start talking about net negative emissions, and the cost of emitting in the future will also send a signal, we believe, to do everything we can to avoid emissions. Last points: we must stop emitting greenhouse gases. We also have to start removing some of it to get the technologies going and do this right. We focus a lot of permanent removals. That means geological storage. Believe that's what is necessary to compensate for remaining emissions or start pulling CO2 out of the air. And just standard point: low quality CDR cannot compensate for continued emissions. Low quality can be debated, but low permanence carbon removal is not a compensation for residual emissions. It's important to increase the uptake in forest and so on, but it's not an excuse to keep emitting. I put them in one extra slide if I had time, but that's just to show our view on storing CO2 versus using it for a fuel. The energy intensity of converting carbon to an e-fuel, such as kerosene for aviation or methanol for shipping, is very energy demanding. And we look into a period of years, maybe decades, where we need all the green power we can for electrifying transport, heating, industry, and then producing green hydrogen or power to X, but without a carbon source until maybe one day where we have enough power to do both. But simply there's a risk that carbon capture and use for e-fuels will cannibalize on scarce resources. That's at least what the energy demand shows. So we have to be very, very careful how we do this, where we do not have enough green or low carbon energy for all purposes. So that's just a warning, and maybe something we can touch upon later on in another forum. I believe this is very important. And then, if of course storage of carbon is not available in Finland and not so much in Sweden, but I think that both Denmark and Norway are happy to help you with that. I do not have any slides on it, but also Denmark is currently investigating a number of onshore, nearshore, and offshore storage sites with the potential of storing CO2 at gigaton scale. So transporting by ship or later on pipeline from Finland and Sweden to Denmark and or Norway is possible. So I believe you should keep this option open. If you run into risk that using it for fuels or other things is also taking some power for purposes that you would need in the transition. So that was it for me. I hope I kept time, and I'm happy to debate this further.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Thank you for sharing the experience from Denmark. And it's also good to start seeing numbers being put on different options. It makes the discussion more concrete. I understand that you will be staying with us until the discussion. So if any of you have questions about Tobias' presentation or what is happening in Denmark, please do note those down as well, so that we can get back to them a bit later. We have been very lucky in the project to be able to recruit the best sampos on the market. So we have not one, but two brilliant sampos who have been working on this project. And not to be confused with the previous sampo, now we have Sampo Soimakallio from the Finnish Environment Institute. And he has been doing the heavy lifting on an issue that I have been trying to avoid personally for a long time, which is reporting and accounting. And because Sampo has done the hard work, now we can hear from him and I don't have to do that. So Sampo, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Oras, for this nice introduction, and I would like to remind that there might be also other clever samples available, so let's get back on that later. But anyway, good morning, everyone. So I tried to summarize briefly how carbon dioxide removal and use are taken into account in greenhouse gas reporting and accounting. So starting first, what do we mean with greenhouse gas reporting, especially so-called Annex 1 countries mentioned in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? They are required to report their anthropogenic territorial greenhouse gas emissions annually to the convention. And the reporting is carried out following the guidelines provided by the IPCC. The basic principle regarding CO2 emissions and removals in these guidelines goes so that fossil CO2 emissions is reported as such in the sector where the particular emissions take place. But regarding CCU products, there is actually an exception of this principle, and I will come back to that soon. Then regarding biomass CO2 flows, they are not reported as flows as such, but they are reported as carbon stock changes under land use change and forestry sector. Then if CO2 is permanently stored, these emissions can be fully deducted from the sector where this CO2 capture takes place. So basically, if there are transfers of CO2 flows, in this case, between countries, this is taken into account in a country, in a sector where the carbon dioxide capture takes place. There is also a principle that there is no reason to differentiate, to use differentiated treatment for biogenic or fossil carbon in case they are captured and permanently stored. So this means, according to these rules, that if we capture biogenic CO2 and permanently store it, it will be reported as negative emission, in other words, as carbon removal. Then what do we mean with the greenhouse gas accounting? So basically this means that the realized greenhouse gas emissions as they are reported, they are accounted towards certain targets or commitments. So in the EU, we have three different climate policy pillars, the basic pillars, and so-called sectors in which the accounting is carried out. First of all, there is the EU emission trading sector, in which basically CO2 emissions from large power plant and industry plants are regulated, and those emissions are taken into account at the EU level accounting, EU level targets and caps set for the EU emission trading scheme. And then there are these two different other regulations, so-called effort sharing regulation and LULUCF regulation, which are member state specific at the first place. So they set binding targets for the member states for these sectors. And it is worth to note that when this effort sharing, when the greenhouse gas balance for these so-called non-ETS sectors outside the EU ETS, excluding LULUCF sector, how this greenhouse gas balance is calculated. It is calculated in a way that first we take the total greenhouse gas emissions of a country, excluding LULUCF emissions, and then we deduct those emissions which are regulated under the EU ETS from that. And that way we get the result for the so-called non-ETS sectors. It means that if there is carbon removals taking place, for example, in industry or energy sector, it will be then accounted for the effort sharing regulation, according to our understanding. And then for this LULUCF sector, there are specific rules which are applied when this accounting is carried out, and they are quite complex in this existing LULUCF regulation. I don't go those in this presentation. In addition, it is important to understand that the EU's nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, it is common to the EU. It is a sum of all these three pillars. It is common to the EU, and there is no EU legislation available that would allow member states to make so-called corresponding adjustments to their specific targets. So then regarding these carbon dioxide removal technologies, how they are taken into account in greenhouse gas reporting and accounting. So the basic principle is that if these technologies are detected in the greenhouse gas reporting, they are accounting either for LULUCF sector or for effort sharing sector, depending on the case, depending on what technology is considered and where that is accounted. It is important to understand that whether technology is detected in the greenhouse gas reporting is not that straightforward at all. It depends on, first of all, if it's recognized in the IPCC guidelines, whether there are guidelines, how the reporting is taken into account, what kind of measures, what kind of methods member state or reporting country applies in the greenhouse gas reporting, whether it's detected there, and that also depends on if there is reliable data available, things like that. But in case it's detected, it's then accounted. It's also important to understand that there are rules and gaps within the accounting which might influence on how beneficial CO2 removal is in the accounting, especially in the LULUCF regulation. Currently, there are no greenhouse gas reporting guidelines for certain technologies, especially for ducts, enhanced weathering, and these ocean-based technologies. If BECS is applied, and if it's applied so that reliable data is utilized, and according to the IPCC guidelines, so-called Tier 3 method, then it can be taken into account, and it will then benefit the effort sharing regulation and the targets of a country under the effort sharing regulation. Ducts, it's not mentioned at all in these IPCC guidelines, so it's unclear whether it would be taken into account. If it would be taken into account, then it would also benefit the targets under the effort sharing regulation. Then regarding carbon capture and utilization, so like I mentioned, the basic principle is that CO2 emissions from fossil-based emissions are taken into account, are reported as such. But regarding this kind of situation where we capture carbon dioxide and use it, release it, for example, in the other sector, according to the IPCC rules, this is basically not considered. So it means that we don't deduct the CO2 which is captured from the sector where the capture takes place, and we don't calculate the emissions when the emissions take place. So basically this means that CO2 content of carbon CCU products is considered carbon neutral, regardless of what technology is used. However, if the carbon is permanently stored in products, there are this kind of products also available, then the story is a bit different. So it makes then the fossil CO2 in CCU products in a way carbon neutral. So this is corresponding then to CCS, and it's accounted then either under EU ETS or effort sharing regulation, depending on the case. And then if biomass-based CO2 is in CCU products and permanently stored, this is then corresponding to CDR technology, and then it would be accounted under the effort sharing regulation. And once again, this is still unclear for ducks. Some key conclusions and recommendations regarding reporting and accounting. So first of all, I would like to mention that these IPCC guidelines, they are sound. There is always some reason why certain technology is not considered. Perhaps there is not reliable data available, too much uncertainties, too much risks, environmental risks, whatever. Still, I feel that it would make sense to clarify these guidelines, to mention at least what are the reasons why certain technologies are not considered. For example, ducks, enhanced weathering, ocean-based methods, things like that. So this could be clarified and improved. Also, another thing is that there is a possibility to produce CCU products where we create like a new temporary carbon pool for this temporary, in case where carbon dioxide is not permanently stored, but for example, long-living products. And if these kind of products would be available, then we could argue that we have created a new carbon pool, which basically could be taken into account in greenhouse gas reporting. So this is also an issue that should be clarified. And in case one of these technologies could be taken into account in the reporting, then this also should be clarified in the guidelines, in which sector it would be taken into account, in which way, what kind of methods to be applied, things like that. Then regarding the EU accounting, like the previous speaker also mentioned, this creates basically direct or indirect incentives for these technologies. So with a direct incentive, I mean that there is the EU ETS carbon price, and if the price is high enough, and if the economic operators feels that it is cost efficient and useful for them to, let's say, apply CCS or CCU to substitute, let's say, fossil fuel emissions regulated under the EU ETS, then they can apply it, and there is an incentive to do that through carbon price, and by that way avoid or reduce the need of CO2 emission allowances. However, this is not regarding CDR at all, because it's not covered under the EU ETS. But like I mentioned, there are these indirect incentives through member state-specific binding targets set in the effort sharing regulation and LULUCF regulation. So basically, these binding targets create indirect incentives, which means that there are incentives for EU member states to reduce their emissions, and to do that and to reach those targets, and to do that they can apply CDR technologies which are detected in the greenhouse gas reporting, or CCUS technologies. However, because this affects the member states and not the economic operators, there are no direct incentives for the economic operators, and then thus it is up to national policies whether and how the economic operators are then directly incentivized to deploy these technologies. Finally, I would like to give a kind of recommendation to the EU side. We know that this CDR deployment, it should be significantly boosted in order to get to the Paris Agreement targets. That's evident. Considering that, the EU should clarify the targets for CDR, how much they should be applied, how those targets should be reached, what is the role of the EU-level policy in reaching those targets, what is left to the national policy, and perhaps last but not least, what kind of technologies are then to be boosted and how to ensure that these are sustainable in its broad meaning. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sampo, for walking us through the maze of reporting and accounting. Now I will have to change hats and transform myself from a facilitator to a presenter to provide you the very last presentation of today. And after that, we will dive into the discussion. And I can see a lot of interesting questions coming online. Please keep them coming. There have been multiple references to policies throughout this seminar, and I'm now happy to present the findings from a policy perspective for national policies, particularly for Finland, from our project. Much of our work is based on a policy benchmarking we did, covering 8 countries that were considered particularly interesting and relevant for Finland. And we looked at the range of different policies and measures, from regulation to different pricing instruments such as taxes and emissions trading, through funding to others such as information. And we covered a bit more than 130 different policies and measures in these countries. And as you can see, we also looked at the examples of Sweden and Denmark, which we heard about today already. And based on that policy benchmarking, based on literature, expert views, we piled a list of policy options. And just to clarify, it is really a list of options. It is not a list of to-do for the next government. It is just a selection of different ideas that are already being implemented somewhere or could be of interest for a country like Finland. And we went through these different policy options from various perspectives, looking at where they have been applied, what kind of solutions they could be useful for, feasibility, evidence base, also climate and business potential and costs. And based on this, we then came up with policy recommendations how to deal with this particular option. And as we have a fairly long list of policy proposals, I can now only, with the limited time that we have here, tickle your imagination by basically giving some hints about these different options. However, of course, again, in the report, you will find more information as well as in the annexes. There have been references to specific targets for negative emissions already today. That is also something we propose in our report and is also quite widely shared in the literature. This could be done in the Climate Act that has been revised lately in Finland, that already has targets for net emissions, but not specific targets for negative emissions yet. There is a need for a strategy for carbon use and removal also in Finland, like in many peer countries, whether it's a standalone strategy or part of a wider strategy, such as the climate and energy strategy that Finland has been traditionally producing every government term. That is, of course, up to the policymakers to decide. However, what matters is that there is a clear view on how to proceed when it comes to carbon use and removal in this country. There are some laws that are probably quite relevant for this space, such as the CCS law and the law implementing the emissions trading scheme in Finland. Those could be reviewed and updated if necessary to better allow for the implementation of these solutions also in Finland. A roundtable on carbon use and removal could bring together stakeholders and experts and policymakers to exchange views and update the current status of implementation and inform policy making. Voluntary markets have also been referenced a couple of times today. Finland has been doing quite extensive work in the past couple of years, thanks to certain experts that we can also see in this audience today, looking at different ways to support voluntary markets. But the carbon removal side of the voluntary markets could be still strengthened, and there is some room for policy support there as well. And then finally, we do see that Finland could play an even more active role when it comes to different international initiatives in this space, such as under mission innovation. Now, another issue that has been referred to already as well is the need to introduce financial incentives for deployment of these various solutions. And we would basically try to cover two aspects. First is the R&D and I side of these solutions. We would recommend establishing a dedicated funding program for these purposes. It can be a funding window under an existing mechanism to make it faster to implement and more effective, or it could be something that is a standalone mechanism that is, of course, up for the relevant authorities to decide, but there is a clear need for a dedicated funding window or mechanism for these solutions. In terms of the deployment of solutions, again, there is a need for financial incentives. However, it is not yet fully clear whether a particular mechanism is the best option or whether we should look at various different options. Here we have listed the reverse auctions as from the Swedish case, emission price floors as applied in the UK, and tax credits that have been extensively used in the US as some options. There could be some others out there. What matters is that there is a clear policy signal to the market that there is a financial incentive to deploy these solutions when it comes to CDR and negative emissions, and to come to the point where decisions can be made with a strong evidence base, we need further studies on this topic. And after that, decisions are in order. Finally, we also identified a number of issues that would merit further studies, especially when it comes to different policy options. We don't really have perhaps enough information about different options yet at this stage. There are interesting ideas about mandating either capturing carbon or using it as a raw material, kind of a blending obligation. Finland is a strong mining country. We produce a lot of mining wastes as a result. Some of these could also store carbon in the future, how we could incentivize and enable that. Then green deals have been used quite successfully in Finland for many purposes. They could be perhaps also used for creating first mover markets for CCU products. And perhaps a bit outlandish, but possibly interesting idea would also be to set an end date for releasing fossil carbon from point sources, period. We have a similar law in place in Finland for the use of coal power, but that could possibly be extended to other large point sources of fossil carbon in the future. Hopefully our project is able to provide a stronger evidence base for policy making, but we do also identify some gaps that are still remaining even after our work. One is what was covered from a Danish perspective in Tobias's presentation, which is basically to better and more concretely identify different strategic choices we have ahead of us. We have a lot of different technologies, a lot of different solutions, a lot of different sectors and use cases, and to better understand where to focus, what would be the most effective way to go forward, that requires some further study as well. And then, as was referenced in many previous presentations, we do have some possibly interesting but clearly less mature options out there that need further study, and Finland can play a role there as well. And this is where I would like to end my presentation side and change hats again to go back to my facilitator mode. Thank you very much. Thank you indeed very much for your patience. You have been patiently listening to a long list of presentations, and now it's really time to hear from you. We have a lot of interesting questions coming online, but obviously we want to hear also from you who are here present in Helsinki. So if you have, and I'm sure you have many questions, please do raise your hand physically here. I can already see at least one. But before we start with that, I would just like to perhaps share some of the questions coming online, and I can report that many of them cover reporting and accounting. So Sampo, brace yourself. So there's a question if BECS in Finland is included in the Finnish national greenhouse gas accounting and therefore cannot be sold on the voluntary carbon markets. Just note this down, I will list this here. When carbon is stored in products and it's exported to other countries, what happens then? How is permanence defined in these reporting and accounting rules? And finally, something that was perhaps already answered in your presentation, how are BECS or BECCU treated in national greenhouse gas inventories? So just to give you time to think about these, and now we can take the first question from the floor here.
Petter Häver, Finnish Energy. Questions, if you allow. First, related actually something you told already, question to Malin. Are there any estimates on what the auction price could be? And secondly, what is the aim for Swedish government to calculate the bio-CCS emissions? Is it ESR or LULUCF or something else? Then on a bio side, there are different last times for different bioproducts. For example, how they are used. Is there a possibility to have something similar for BECCU products? So that the last time for plastics is say 30 years used in some way or in another place. And well, maybe we start with those.
There was a question to Malin, and because that happened, then I can also piggyback on that question, because there was something online that was also addressed to Malin, which was how do you see the role of biochar as a CDR technology in Sweden, and how is that perhaps addressed in Sweden?
Thank you very much. Okay, it works, good. Well, so in terms of the price, there is of course an estimate, a range that is quite big that has been mentioned, but as of now, we can only speculate. I mean, now it's up to the companies to kind of make their studies, look at what their specific cost might be, and then actually participate in this bidding process. And so there is large uncertainty at this point. And in terms of, I'm sorry, the second question was about, oh yeah, exactly. Well, so that is actually an ongoing discussion, and it was very interesting to look at to listen to the reporting and accounting from the Finnish perspective, and it's actually an ongoing discussion where bio-CCS actually might be accounted for in Sweden. So that's fairly unclear, but the Swedish Energy Agency is of course looking into this question, and yeah, I would say it's an ongoing discussion at this point with much uncertainty. And then lastly, we had something on
biochar.
Biochar, yeah. Well, so biochar, Sweden does have potential for biochar, and it has been considered. And in this inquiry that I was talking about from 2020, Vägvalsutredningen, they actually chose to exclude biochar from the reverse auctions at this point. But I mean, there is potential, and it might be included in the future. But as of now, it's not included in the reverse auctions, at least.
And we also have Esko here, who is one of the best, if not the best, biochar expert in Finland, who can also perhaps come in. I can just say that in Stockholm, the Stockholm city, whatever it's called, the department that is in charge of parks is already using biochar in Stockholm parks, if I've understood correctly. Tobias, just to alert you, the same question about biochar was also directed at you, and I will come back to you in a moment. But before that, I wonder if Sampo has had a bit of time to think about all these reporting and accounting questions that keep coming clearly the hot topic today.
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. I hope I got them all. So starting from the BECCS in Finland target. So according to our understanding, like I mentioned in my presentation, it goes so that if BECCS is applied in a way which can be taken into account in the greenhouse gas reporting. So if it can be proven that it's permanently stored and applied according to the IPCC guidelines, it is taken into account in the greenhouse gas reporting, and after that, then it helps Finland's national effort sharing target. So it's taken into account there. Then the second question was related to CO2 transport between countries. I also touched this in my presentation, and according to our understanding, it goes so that the CO2 is deducted from the sector and the country in which CO2 capture takes place, so it benefits that country. Regarding permanency, this is something that I'm not an expert at all in this area. So there are rules, there are certain certificates which then needs to be fulfilled. I don't know, but this is something that can be shown, and I think there are also rules in the EU ETS for fossil-based CCS. Similar rules perhaps could be applied regardless of the source of CO2 in this sense, and by that way show the permanency. Then the last question was related to biomass-based CCU products, how this is taken into account. Well, if we exclude harvested wood products as a biomass-based CCU, so harvested wood products are considered as a separate category reported under LULUCF sector and taken into account in the LULUCF regulation. But if we exclude that and consider other types of biomass-based CCU, this is not detected in the reporting or accounting. Basically, it is similar to fossil-based CCU, so it's carbon neutral in this sense. So if it's cost efficient, these products can be used to substitute the use of emission-intensive products in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Sampo. I believe Lotta from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry had something on the same issue, probably. Am I guessing right? Okay, well then I would take at this point Tobias from Denmark, if we can get him on the screen and hear him. The question was about biochar and whether that plays a role in Denmark and what kind of a role perhaps.
Yes, it does play a role, but to what extent is still to be decided. There are some companies looking into doing large-scale pyrolysis and biochar. But the exact carbon removal we get out of it is still to be determined. There's some research being done at the moment saying that 60 to 80% of the carbon is stored permanently during a period of 100 years when you store biochar in agricultural soils. So that relates to how should we finance biochar or see it as a carbon removal technologies, and it is not, as in Sweden, not included in the current incentive schemes, but there's some discussion if there should be set specific funding aside for getting biochar started in all government scenarios and also in Concito scenario. Biochar plays an important role where we use the straw or other residues from agriculture. And relating to prices, the companies themselves are quite optimistic. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think they believe around 50 euro per ton of CO2 permanently stored. Government has some quite higher estimate, but also depends on if you sell some of the leftover products from the pyrolysis. If you include that in the business case, we also believe that you can do it up below 100 euro per ton of CO2 permanently stored, but we do need some more research to clarify how exactly this can be funded, taking into account permanence. And we will look into that in the coming years and try also to do this large scale in Denmark. I'm pretty convinced.
Thank you, Tobias. Matthias Friedal is pointing out on the internet that biochar in Sweden can get investment support from the Climate Leap program as well. I saw Teppo asking for the floor, and sorry I haven't had time to respond to your email. It's been a crazy week. Teppo, go ahead.
I know, I'm sure. Thank you for the great seminar, and the results. They are very interesting and provide a very good basis for the next government on how to include these issues in the next government program. So Teppo Säkkinen from Finland Chamber of Commerce. Two questions. One would be, did you venture in the study any estimates on what could be the scale of CDR in Finland realistically by 2030 and 2035? Is it thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of tons of CO2? Then a more specific question. There are various technologies that all should be promoted. Regarding the bio CCU, I find it very interesting from the point of view that if we can get industrial scale commercial activity with demand, market demand for products such as concrete or polymers that sequester carbon and can create a lasting carbon storage, that could be from the point of view of public finance, more cost-effective because there is market demand. It could create industrial activity and could have great climate benefits. But if, for example, if you look at the financial incentives, there is no benefit from the ETS because biomass use is outside of the ETS, so it requires targeted policies. So could you provide any insight on how to promote particularly bio-CCU?
Thank you. The potential of CDR in Finland, who would like to take that? I'm looking at Alex, who is looking away to Sampo. So if it's going to Sampo, and I'm assuming Sampo Mäkikori in this case, I'm going to give you another question, which is about did the project consortium assess technological export possibilities of CDR for Finland?
Thank you for the very good questions. In the report, we have set some kind of like estimates, what kind of limitations based on the CO2 volumes that are available in Finland at the moment. For instance, looking at the CO2 emissions from the pulp and paper industry, especially on the coastlines of Finland, and then on the other hand, from the product markets, looking at what kind of volumes are produced at the moment in Finland to give some kind of estimate on the possible scale for Finland. The second question was...
Technological export potential.
Yes, we have described that in the report to name some things. For instance, in ducks, we see that there might be especially great technology export potential. For Pouty X, it might consider both technology and the products itself. Bio-CCS, it might be more like a Nordic perspective, or maybe and relevant for Finland, but in a descriptive manner, qualitatively we have put those in the report, but there are no quantitative estimates for the export potential.
Indeed, and both of these questions, I would argue, would merit further studies so that we can get deeper and perhaps closer to what we could hear from Denmark in the previous presentation. I think we can do two more. Sorry, we are running out of time. Perhaps the gentleman from the audience there, and then Kenneth to top it all off. Yes, please.
Jari Kolehmainen, Demet Ltd. Just might some of you have an educated guess what are the implications of this new type of regulations that came out this week from EU, that the e-fuels are now qualifying as the power source of new vehicles after 35. So what are the implications of this decision? Has anybody thought this yet for this CCS scheme or CCU?
Well, I can give it a shot. To my understanding, the legislative text was not changed, so this is basically like a commission recital or a commission footnote, and that's not going to change the legislation that is going to guide the markets. But if anyone has a different view on the importance of this deal between the Germans and the commission, then do please let us know. Then finally, Kenneth, and then I'm going to answer the question from Teppo that was unanswered so far, and then we need to wrap it up.
So thank you very much. Alexander down there, right? I'm going to ask a couple of questions on numbers. It's a bit boring, but I've been looking forward to ask an expert about this. I noticed your numbers, your costs, the cost you presented on BECCS and DACs, and considering that we have the concentration of 0.04% of CO2 in the atmosphere, and point sources of CO2 are usually a few percent, up to 20 maybe, and still your projected cost for DACs was 100, and the cost range of BECCS was up to 120. So that relation, if you have a comment on that, as one question. Second question is on TRLs. I've seen with my own eyes that you can buy a production unit for biochar and start producing biochar. They operate well. You can just order one essentially, and still you have the TRL 8 for that one, compared to TRL 9 for CO2 storage, which, I mean, there are a few projects in the world, but they're pilots, I would say, although they've been operating since late 90s. But isn't TRL 8 for biochar a bit pessimistic or conservative?
Thank you for the questions. Of course, I mean, there are some ranges, and like Sampo said, in some cases, we try to be reasonably conservative. This means that our lower limit is rather low and upper limit is rather high when talking about the costs. But in general, I think the interpretation that DACs we perceived as a much more expensive option versus point source, I think it's very correct. And I think our kind of range for DACs, the higher end was into 600, and exactly the energy demands for concentrating very dilute streams, I mean, they will always be on the high side. And so obviously that is one reason why we kind of down prioritize it versus point sources in bio-based CO2, especially in Finnish context. And then for biochar, again, I have some background personally in a large petrochemical industry, and probably then maybe from that sense, I mean, the TRL 9 is usually something in our mind when we talk about some megaton scale. Of course, I mean, biochar, you can argue that these are large operating facilities in kilotons, tens of kilotons, and perhaps 100 kilotons are attainable. So I can take the argument that maybe we can talk about 8.5 or even 9 technology readiness, if that it clearly shows that it is a deployable technology, and it can be, if the pool of feedstock is available, brought to megaton scale.
And my apologies, I almost forgot Lotta, so let's give Lotta the last intervention.
Thank you, Aras. Mine is not about the numbers, it's about the estimation. So during this project, I've learned that Finland has potential for bioenergy capture, but then our potential, and this is, I'm looking at Sampo, Mäki, Kouri, and Malin, and maybe Tobias, the storage, that's our challenge. And it seems like the Denmark and Norway, the North Sea area could be a potential area. And thinking about a cost efficiency from the state perspective, what should we do? Is there a lot of demand for those deposits? Is it very expensive to store there? Is that a viable solution now, or throughout looking at 2050 to consider that? What would be the policy advice for our side? Thank you.
Wow, who is going to cover that in 30 seconds? Any volunteers? Kenneth, perfect.
We have a lot of commercial operators in Sweden that are preparing to do BECCS now, and they're desperately looking for storage. The North, what is it called? Norwegian project, Northern Lights, is the phase 1 is already full. and I think there's a queue for phase 2. So now the Danes are working on storage, and Iceland is also developing services. And I think that this is an area where Nordic countries jointly, for example, through the Nordic Council of Ministers and other forum, could take charge and start planning, because 2050, 2045, 2050, there's a very, very large need for storage. Coming from, CO2 streams coming from virtually all Nordic countries, and they need, all that CO2 needs a home. And these are large investments with long lead times. So, I mean, there's certainty needed for investments. So I think, Nordic policymakers really have to acknowledge that we have a very ambitious neutrality target on a Nordic level, and all Nordic countries, and they need to cooperate and start coordinating, CO2 supply and where it's going to go.
And as luck has it, the Nordic Council of Ministers has just commissioned a new project from Kenneth, I, and some other people, so perhaps we will have more information sooner rather than later. And just to finally answer Teppo's question about CCU products, Bekku products perhaps specifically, one of our proposals was a Green Deal to get the first mover market started, so use public procurement as a facility to get those markets going. Now we have eaten up Hanne Siikavirta's concluding words time, but we will definitely want to hear from you. You get the opportunity to wrap up this interesting day. Hanne, you have the floor.
So I've been a steering group member and given this opportunity to give concluding words in minus time, but I will not try to wrap up this interesting day or morning. So I just want to thank our guest speakers. So it has also already become evident that Nordics is a very interesting area in this carbon removals, and it was really interesting to learn more about the situation in Sweden and Denmark. And I also want to thank our project team for improving our knowledge base, especially on these industrial carbon removals, and also giving the very concrete policy recommendations for us to sort of digest and discuss. And also I want to thank all participants here in Tiedekulma and online for very active participation and good discussion, which I think touched upon the broad spectrum of this project, like the technologies and markets and the policies, and it seems that we would have need more time for discussion. So, so it has now, we have heard the results of the project in a nutshell, and also had very brief time to exchange thoughts and views. And as already said by Juho in the opening words, that this report is already available and in English, and will be also in Finnish. And it has also mentioned here that it's very interesting times in Finland, so we will be having the parliamentary elections on Sunday, and I think it's useful to have a closer look at this project and continue the discussions and works in our various domains in this interesting area. Thanks.